The 67-year-old veteran's trembling fingers traced the nodules spreading across her neck like a map of betrayal, her breath forming desperate clouds in the December air outside Wellpoint Medical. Sarah Mitchell's knees buckled against the snow-covered concrete. The Pentagon would later classify what grew inside her as biological warfare. Dr. Rebecca Harrison burst through the emergency room doors, her stethoscope swinging wildly as she screamed for a crash cart. The attending nurse dropped her clipboard, medical supplies scattering across polished floors like fallen soldiers. Sarah's Purple Heart bracelet caught the fluorescent light, the same bracelet she'd worn through 847 days of being told her spreading masses were just anxiety. Her husband Tom's final photo smiled from her trembling wallet, unaware his widow was dying from the same cover-up that killed him. "Get me her Wellpoint records now!" Harrison's voice cracked with urgency and rage. What had they been hiding? And how many other veterans would die before Christmas morning revealed the truth? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 2 years earlier, Sarah Mitchell had believed in simple things. Morning coffee tasted better from Tom's old Army mug. Buddy the golden retriever needed his daily walk regardless of Vermont weather. And doctors told the truth. The farmhouse in Millbrook felt cavernous, without Tom's laughter echoing through rooms that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and the apple wood he'd burn in their stone fireplace. 67 years old, and I still set the table for two, she whispered to Buddy, who watched her with those knowing brown eyes that seemed to understand grief better than most humans. Old habits die harder than old soldiers, don't they, boy? The kitchen calendar bore red circles around doctor appointments like battle scars. Unpaid medical bills formed a precarious tower beside Tom's Purple Heart, which caught morning sunlight streaming through gingham curtains Sarah had sewn during happier decades. Her pill organizer, a plastic monument to aging, sat divided into 12 compartments, each day a small surrender to the inevitable march of time. Tom used to say she had more fight in her pinky than most folks carried in their whole bodies. These days, Sarah questioned where that fight had gone. The photograph on her nightstand showed them young and invincible. Sarah in her crisp nurse's uniform, Tom resplendent in his dress blues, and baby Lisa giggling between them. 3 years had passed since Lisa's last phone call, their relationship another casualty of grief's collateral damage. Her monthly income of $1,847 barely covered necessities, let alone the mounting medical bills that arrived like unwelcome relatives. The small lump behind her left ear had appeared sometime after Thanksgiving, tender to touch and accompanied by fatigue that felt different from simple exhaustion. Night sweats soaked through Tom's old t-shirts she wore to bed, seeking comfort in fabric that had once wrapped around the love of her life. "Just getting older," she told herself, the same phrase that had become her daily mantra. At 67, aches and mysterious lumps seemed as inevitable as Vermont winters and Sunday sermons at First Baptist, where she still occupied the same pew she'd shared with Tom for 34 years. Mrs. Henderson from next door had mentioned similar symptoms during their weekly grocery trips to Shaw's. "Getting older ain't for sissies," the 73-year-old would say, adjusting her own collection of mysterious bumps and bruises. The solidarity felt comforting, a shared experience of bodies betraying minds that still felt 35. Buddy's behavior had grown peculiar lately, sniffing around her neck with the intensity he'd once reserved for tracking raccoons through their apple orchard. The previous owner had mentioned Buddy's unusual sensitivity to medical changes, something about diabetes detection, but Sarah dismissed such notions as folk tales people told themselves to feel special about their pets. The appointment card for Wellpoint Medical Group sat prominently displayed on her refrigerator, scheduled for next Tuesday at 2:15. Insurance would cover most of it, and surely Dr. Webb would have simple explanations for simple problems. After all, she was just getting older, and doctors knew best. The WellPoint Medical Group waiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken promises. Sarah had arrived 15 minutes early, clutching her insurance cards and a handwritten list of symptoms that Tom would have been proud of, organized, thorough, and honest. 47 minutes later, she was still surrounded by outdated magazines featuring celebrities she didn't recognize, and medical advice that seemed written for people half her age. Sarah Mitchell? The nurse's voice carried the mechanical warmth of someone who'd called 1,000 names that week. The walk to examination room 3 felt longer than her daily trek to the mailbox, her legs heavy with fatigue that had been building for months, like storm clouds on a summer horizon. Dr. Marcus Webb entered without knocking, his attention already divided between her chart and the computer screen that seemed more interesting than the patient sitting before him. At 34, he possessed the confident bearing of someone who'd never doubted his own expertise, his white coat pristine and his stethoscope worn like a badge of authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, I see you're here about some lumps and fatigue." His fingers never left the keyboard as he spoke, typing notes that couldn't possibly capture the complexity of what she was experiencing. "You're 67, recently widowed, living alone. These symptoms often present in patients dealing with anxiety and grief." Sarah's carefully prepared speech caught in her throat like morning phlegm. "Doctor, I've got these bumps, and I'm tired all the time. This isn't normal tired. It's like someone drained my battery and forgot to plug me back in. I was a nurse for 32 years before I retired, and I know my body." Dr. Webb's examination lasted less than 3 minutes. His hands briefly touched her neck, but his mind seemed elsewhere, perhaps calculating how many more patients he needed to see before lunch. The lumps that kept her awake at night, worrying and prodding and wondering, received barely a glance. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're 67 years old. Your body is changing, and grief can manifest in physical ways that feel very real. What you're describing sounds like anxiety to me." He was already reaching for his prescription pad, the diagnosis predetermined before she'd even spoken. "I'm going to start you on Xanax, 0.5 milligrams twice daily. Follow up in 3 months. "But doctor, shouldn't we run some tests? Blood work, maybe a scan?" Sarah's voice carried the desperation of someone watching a lifeboat sail away. "I nursed cancer patients for 3 decades. I know what lymph nodes feel like, and these don't feel right. Doctor." Webb's smile held the patience reserved for difficult elderly patients who read too much on the internet. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been practicing medicine longer than... Well, let's focus on what we know works. Anxiety can cause all sorts of physical symptoms. Trust me on this." The prescription felt like a dismissal in her trembling hands. $45 for the copay, money that could have bought groceries for 3 days, and another monthly expense for pills that treated symptoms she wasn't convinced she had. The insurance paperwork was a maze of deductibles and prior authorizations that seemed designed to discourage seeking care. Walking to her truck, Sarah noticed the poster in the break room through an open door. "Efficiency Metrics, February Rankings." Dr. Webb's name appeared near the top of some list she couldn't quite read, but the general atmosphere suggested competition rather than compassion guided this practice. Buddy greeted her return with unusual intensity, immediately focusing on her neck area with the dedication of a customs inspector. His previous owner, Mrs. Garrett, had mentioned something about Buddy's sensitivity to medical changes before her diabetes diagnosis, but Sarah had dismissed it as the kind of folk wisdom people attach to pets they love too much. "Even my dog thinks I'm losing my mind," she muttered, scratching behind Buddy's ears as he continued his concerned inspection. The golden retriever had been Tom's final gift, adopted from the shelter just weeks before Tom's own cancer diagnosis. Maybe the doctor's right, boy. Maybe I'm just getting old and crazy. That evening, Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a casserole and unsolicited advice. "How'd your appointment go, honey?" The 73-year-old settled into Tom's old recliner with the familiarity of long friendship. "I hope that doctor of yours is better than mine." "Been telling me my stomach pains are just acid reflux for 6 months now." Sarah shared her frustration while they ate tuna noodle casserole from Tom's good china. "He made me feel like I was some hysterical old woman making up symptoms for attention, prescribed anxiety pills, and sent me on my way." "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, dabbing her lips with one of Sarah's wedding napkins, "doctors know best, I suppose. We're not spring chickens anymore. Maybe it really is just our age catching up with us." The Xanax bottle sat unopened on her nightstand that night, a small orange reminder of medical authority she wasn't sure she trusted. Tom's photograph seemed to watch her with concern, and Sarah found herself wondering what he would have done in her situation. By May, the lumps had multiplied like unwelcome house guests, visible now even through Sarah's loose-fitting blouses. What had started as a single tender spot behind her ear had become a constellation of swollen nodes stretching across her neck and down into her armpits. The 15 pounds she'd lost made her clothes hang like fabric scarecrows, and climbing the farmhouse stairs required rest stops that would have embarrassed her younger self. Night sweats had become her cruel companion, soaking through Tom's old army t-shirt she wore to bed, seeking comfort in cotton that still held traces of his presence. Buddy's behavior had grown increasingly agitated, following her from room to room with the dedication of a concerned nurse, whining softly whenever she sat down too quickly or struggled to catch her breath. The second visit to Wellpoint brought a different Dr. Patricia Stone, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who carried herself with the efficiency of someone perpetually behind schedule. Dr. Webb was apparently on vacation, leaving Sarah to explain her worsening symptoms to someone reading his notes like scripture. "I see Dr. Webb noted an anxiety disorder," Dr. Stone said without looking up from the computer screen. "How's the Xanax working for you?" Sarah's frustration bubbled over like an unwatched pot. "Doctor, look at my neck. These bumps weren't here 3 months ago. I've lost 15 pounds and I can barely make it up my own stairs without stopping to catch my breath. This isn't anxiety." Dr. Stone's examination was perfunctory, her hands briefly palpating the obvious swellings before returning to her keyboard. "Lipomas are quite common in elderly patients, Mrs. Mitchell. These feel benign to me. Have you been taking your prescribed medication regularly? I want some tests run." Sarah's voice carried the authority she'd once used with difficult patients during her nursing career. "Blood work, scans, something. I know my body, and something is seriously wrong." "Mrs. Mitchell, your insurance typically doesn't approve that level of testing for anxiety-related symptoms. Let's try increasing your medication first and see how you respond." Dr. Stone was already writing a new prescription, this time for a stronger anti-anxiety medication. Sometimes our minds can convince our bodies that something is wrong when it's really just stress manifesting physically. The drive home felt like defeat wrapped in spring sunshine. Sarah had spent $45 more she couldn't afford for another dismissal, another prescription for problems she wasn't convinced she had. The pills rattled in their orange bottles like dice in a rigged game, promising relief for symptoms that felt as real as the steering wheel beneath her trembling hands. Mrs. Henderson was waiting on her front porch when Sarah pulled into the driveway, her face carrying news that couldn't wait for pleasantries. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something important about my stomach problems." They sat in Sarah's kitchen, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the worn linoleum Tom had promised to replace for 20 years. Mrs. Henderson's hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup, age spots trembling like autumn leaves. My daughter Karen came up from Boston last week. Took one look at me and drove me straight to Mass General, wouldn't take no for an answer. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked like old leather. Sarah, it wasn't acid reflux. It was pancreatic cancer, stage 4. If I'd gotten proper tests 6 months ago when the symptoms started. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and choking. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, a recognition that went deeper than fear. "What are you saying, Helen?" "I'm saying that doctor of mine at Wellpoint, he kept telling me it was just getting older, just stress, just my imagination. Prescribed antacids and anxiety pills while cancer was eating me alive." Mrs. Henderson's tears fell onto the kitchen table where Tom used to read his morning paper. "Karen's furious. Says any first-year medical student would have ordered tests for my symptoms." Sarah's mind raced through the parallels like a nurse reviewing chart notes. Similar symptoms, same dismissive treatment, same medical group owned by the same investment company whose efficiency posters decorated the break room walls. "Helen, how long do they... What did the Boston doctors say?" 6 months, maybe less." "But Sarah, if they'd caught it early when I first started complaining..." Mrs. Henderson gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Honey, you need to get yourself a second opinion before it's too late. Don't let them convince you that you're crazy when your body is screaming that something's wrong." That evening, Sarah sat at Tom's old desk, surrounded by medical bills that had grown from a manageable pile into a mountain of financial anxiety. $847 behind on payments, with collection notices arriving like poison pen letters. She'd considered selling Tom's Purple Heart, the thought making her physically sick, but pride wouldn't pay for proper medical care. The laptop Lisa had given her for Christmas 3 years ago, back when they still spoke, hummed to life with the reluctance of outdated technology. Sarah's fingers, gnarled now with arthritis that seemed to have accelerated alongside her other symptoms, pecked out searches that would have horrified her younger, more trusting self. Lymph node swelling causes led to lymphoma symptoms, which led to medical misdiagnosis lawsuits, which led to a rabbit hole of horror stories about patients ignored, dismissed, and left to die by doctors more concerned with efficiency than accuracy. The photographs of lymphoma patients looked disturbingly familiar, their necks bearing the same constellation of swellings that now decorated Sarah's throat like a grotesque necklace. Buddy's wet nose pressed against her knee, his amber eyes reflecting the computer screen's glow. Tom had always said animals knew things people couldn't see, that Buddy's previous owner had trained him to detect diabetic episodes through scent alone. If a dog could smell blood sugar changes, what else might he be trying to tell her? "I didn't survive Vietnam to be killed by paperwork," she whispered to Tom's photograph, her voice carrying the steel that had once helped her save lives in field hospitals half a world away from this quiet farmhouse where she now fought for her own survival. August brought no relief from the relentless progression of Sarah's declining health. The Vermont summer that should have filled her with energy instead left her exhausted by simple tasks that had once been automatic. Watering Tom's prized tomato garden required 3 rest breaks, and the daily walk to the mailbox had become an expedition requiring careful planning and Buddy's steadying presence. The third visit to Wellpoint coincided with Dr. Webb's return from vacation, his tan and relaxed demeanor a stark contrast to Sarah's increasingly gaunt appearance. The nodules on her neck had grown to golf ball size, visible to anyone who cared to look, stretching the skin in ways that made swallowing coffee a deliberate, painful process. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're looking..." Dr. Webb paused, his practiced bedside manner faltering momentarily at the obvious deterioration. "How have you been feeling on the increased medication?" Sarah's voice, now hoarse and strained, carried the weight of months of frustration. "Doctor, please, just look at me. Really look. These aren't lipomas, and this isn't anxiety. I can barely swallow my morning coffee, and my voice sounds like I've been screaming for hours." Dr. Webb's examination was more thorough this time, his hands carefully palpating the enlarged nodes that now formed visible ridges along Sarah's neck and collarbone. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that medical training would overcome whatever system had been preventing proper diagnosis. "I think we need to discuss depression, Mrs. Mitchell." His words hit her like cold water. Anxiety often progresses to depression, especially in patients dealing with grief and isolation. These physical symptoms you're experiencing, they're very real to you, but depression can manifest in remarkable ways. "Doctor, I was a registered nurse for 32 years. I've seen depression and I've seen cancer. This is not depression." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion and physical strain. "Please, I'm begging you. Order some tests. Blood work, a scan, anything." Dr. Webb's response came with the practiced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused child. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been practicing medicine longer than you've been. Well, let's focus on evidence-based treatment. I'm adding an antidepressant to your regimen, and I think we should consider a psychiatric evaluation." The computer screen that commanded more of his attention than his patient displayed metrics Sarah couldn't fully see, but she caught glimpses of charts and rankings that seemed to track something other than patient outcomes. A nurse's whispered comment about monthly efficiency reviews drifted through the thin walls, adding another piece to a puzzle Sarah was beginning to understand. That afternoon, exhausted and defeated, Sarah found herself in the hospital cafeteria during her mandatory psychiatric evaluation appointment. The psychiatrist had been kind, but ultimately useless, agreeing with Dr. Webb's assessment that her physical symptoms were manifestations of untreated grief and anxiety. "Ma'am, excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with the cashier about WellPoint Medical." The voice belonged to a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed but carrying herself with the nervous energy of someone harboring secrets. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I used to work there, in billing and administration." Sarah looked up from her untouched sandwich, too exhausted for social pleasantries but curious about the earnest concern in the stranger's eyes. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." "Not sure there's much to discuss about WellPoint except their talent for making sick people feel crazy." Jennifer glanced around the cafeteria before sliding into the opposite chair, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mrs. Mitchell, what you're describing, the dismissive treatment, the refusal to order tests, the insistence that everything is anxiety or depression, it's not random. They have quotas." The words hung between them like a confession in a church confessional. Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. "What kind of quotas?" "Doctors are ranked monthly based on their efficiency metrics. How many patients they see per hour, how much they spend per patient on diagnostic tests, how often they refer to specialists." Jennifer's hands shook as she spoke, the tremor of someone violating sacred trusts. "The top performers get bonuses. The bottom performers get pressure to improve their numbers." Sarah's nursing background helped her understand the implications immediately. "You're telling me doctors are financially incentivized to avoid ordering tests and providing thorough care?" "I'm telling you that Apex Investment Partners, the company that owns WellPoint, measures success by profit margins, not patient outcomes. I've seen the internal memos, Mrs. Mitchell. Patient satisfaction is secondary to cost containment." Jennifer pulled out her phone, showing Sarah photographs of documents that looked like smoking guns in a medical malpractice case. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Months of dismissive treatment, mounting symptoms, and mounting medical bills suddenly made horrible sense. "Why are you telling me this? You could get in trouble." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears that spoke of personal loss and professional guilt. "Because my mother went through the same thing you're describing." Same symptoms, same dismissive treatment, same doctors telling her it was all in her head. By the time she got proper care at a different hospital, her lymphoma had progressed too far. The drive home was a blur of anger and vindication. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel with more strength than she'd felt in months, purpose replacing the defeated exhaustion that had been consuming her. Buddy seemed to sense the change, his tail wagging with the first enthusiasm he'd shown since her symptoms began. That evening brought an unexpected phone call from Lisa, their first conversation in over a year. Sarah's daughter's voice carried the polished authority of her Boston law practice, but underneath lay concern that maternal instincts could detect despite their estrangement. "Mom, I've been hearing things. Mrs. Henderson's daughter, Karen, called me about your health problems." Lisa's professional tone couldn't quite mask the worry bleeding through. "She mentioned you've been having issues with your medical care." Sarah felt torn between pride and desperation. Admitting she needed help felt like surrender. But Jennifer Walsh's revelations had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the situation. "Lisa, I don't want to burden you with my problems. You've got your own life in Boston." "Mom, you raised me to be strong, but you also raised me to fight for what's right. If there's something wrong with your medical care, that's exactly the kind of fight I know how to handle." Lisa's voice carried echoes of the little girl who used to bring injured birds to her nurse mother for healing. The financial pressure had reached crisis levels. $2,300 in medical debt, with collection agencies calling daily and threatening letters arriving like unwelcome relatives. Sarah had pulled out Tom's Purple Heart 3 times, holding it and calculating pawn shop values before shame forced her to return it to its place of honor. The church meal train that started after Mrs. Henderson's diagnosis had tried to include Sarah, but pride made accepting charity feel like another defeat. Instead, she'd been skipping meals to afford the medications that weren't helping, creating a downward spiral that even Buddy's concerned attention couldn't halt. Jennifer Walsh's business card sat on Tom's desk like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The former WellPoint employee had offered to share internal documents and connect Sarah with other patients who'd experienced similar dismissive treatment. The prospect of fighting back felt both terrifying and liberating. Late that night, Sarah sat in Tom's recliner with Buddy's warm weight against her legs, staring at the framed photograph that had anchored her through 34 years of marriage and 5 years of widowhood. "Tom, I don't know if I have enough fight left in me for this battle. But if Jennifer's right, if they're doing this to other people..." Buddy's response was to gently mouth Tom's Purple Heart, bringing it to Sarah with the careful precision of a retriever trained to handle precious things. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, Tom's sacrifice demanding that she honor her own life with the same courage he'd shown in service to his country. The decision crystallized like Vermont frost on autumn windows. Tomorrow she would call Jennifer Walsh. Tomorrow she would demand copies of her medical records. Tomorrow she would begin fighting for her life with the same determination that had once helped her save others in field hospitals, where giving up meant death. November arrived with the brutal honesty of Vermont winter, stripping away autumn's gentle deceptions and exposing the stark reality of Sarah's deteriorating condition. The nodules had spread like a grotesque road map across her neck and chest, visible even through the loose sweater she now wore to hide her shrinking frame. 28 pounds lost, her wedding ring sliding freely on fingers that had once been plump with health and happiness. Sleep had become an enemy rather than refuge. The enlarged lymph nodes pressed against her throat with each attempt to lie flat, forcing her to spend nights propped upright in Tom's old recliner while Buddy maintained his vigilant watch from the floor beside her. The golden retriever's behavior had grown increasingly frantic, his training as a medical detection dog manifesting in desperate attempts to alert Sarah to dangers her doctors refused to acknowledge. The fourth visit to Wellpoint brought the crushing weight of systematic dismissal that threatened to break what remained of Sarah's resolve. Dr. Webb's examination lasted barely 5 minutes, his hands perfunctorily touching swellings that now dominated her appearance like a medical textbook illustration of advanced disease. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm concerned about your fixation on these lipomas," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone reserved for difficult elderly patients. "This level of anxiety about normal aging processes suggests we need to adjust your psychiatric medications. I'm going to increase your antidepressant dosage and refer you to our behavioral health specialist." Sarah's voice, now barely above a whisper due to the pressure on her vocal cords, carried decades of medical knowledge and mounting desperation. "Dr. Webb, I can barely swallow my morning coffee. My voice sounds like I've been strangled. These aren't lipomas, and this isn't normal aging, Mrs." "Well, Mitchell, sometimes our minds can convince our bodies that something is terribly wrong when it's really just the normal process of getting older combined with unresolved grief." His fingers never stopped typing, adding notes to a medical record that documented symptoms while ignoring their obvious significance. "I think you're catastrophizing normal changes, and that's creating a cycle of anxiety that's making everything feel worse than it actually is." The prescription for stronger psychiatric medications felt like a final insult. $45 she couldn't afford for treatments that addressed imaginary problems while real disease consumed her body. The billing department's reminder about her overdue balance of $2,800 arrived the same day, threatening collection action that would destroy what remained of her financial stability. That afternoon, Sarah's breaking point arrived with the subtlety of a Vermont avalanche. Standing in her kitchen, attempting to prepare Tom's favorite stuffing recipe for a Thanksgiving dinner she might not live to see, her knees buckled without warning. The crash of her body hitting the linoleum echoed through the empty farmhouse like a gunshot, followed by Buddy's immediate frantic barking. Mrs. Henderson found her 20 minutes later, alerted by Buddy's persistent howling and the sight of Sarah's truck still in the driveway well past her usual evening medication time. The 73-year-old neighbor, herself weakened by advancing pancreatic cancer, managed to call 911 before sitting beside Sarah on the cold kitchen floor, holding her hand while they waited for help. "Sarah, honey, you can't keep fighting this alone," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her own voice weakened by the cancer that Wellpoint had allowed to advance beyond treatment. "My Karen's been researching doctors in Boston. Real doctors, at real hospitals, who actually listen to their patients." The ambulance ride to Mercy General Hospital marked Sarah's first encounter with medical professionals who seemed genuinely alarmed by her condition. The paramedic, a young man who reminded her of Tom at that age, kept checking and rechecking her vital signs as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Ma'am, how long have you had these enlarged lymph nodes?" His voice carried professional concern rather than dismissive authority. "Some of these are the size of golf balls. What's your primary care doctor been doing about this?" Sarah's laugh came out as a wheeze that spoke volumes about months of medical gaslighting. 2 years of being told it's all in my head. Anxiety, depression, getting older, everything except what it obviously is." The emergency room at Mercy General operated with an efficiency that prioritized patient care over profit margins. Within 30 minutes, Sarah had been examined by Dr. Rebecca Harrison, a young oncologist whose immediate reaction validated everything Sarah had been trying to communicate to Wellpoint's doctors for nearly 2 years. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something very important," Dr. Harrison said, her hands carefully examining the extensive lymphadenopathy that covered Sarah's neck and chest. "Who has been providing your medical care? Because what I'm seeing here is clearly advanced lymphoma that should have been diagnosed and treated months ago." The words hit Sarah like absolution after years of confession. "So I'm not crazy? I'm not just an anxious old woman making up symptoms for attention?" Dr. Harrison's expression combined professional outrage with genuine compassion. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're one of the sanest patients I've ever met. Your body has been screaming that something was wrong, and you've been absolutely right to insist on proper medical attention. This is medical negligence of the highest order." The CT scan and blood work that followed confirmed what Sarah's nursing instincts had known for months. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3, advanced enough to require immediate and aggressive treatment but still potentially curable if addressed properly. The irony was devastating. 6 months earlier, the prognosis would have been excellent with simple outpatient chemotherapy. "Dr. Harrison, I need to know something," Sarah said, her voice strengthened by vindication and purpose. "How many other patients are going through what I've experienced? How many people are being told their cancer symptoms are anxiety and depression?" The young oncologist's expression darkened with knowledge she clearly wished she didn't possess. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're the fourth patient I've seen this month with advanced cancer that was misdiagnosed as psychiatric illness by WellPoint Medical Group. There's a pattern here that goes beyond individual medical errors." That evening, as Sarah lay in a hospital bed receiving the first proper medical care she'd experienced in 2 years, her phone rang with a call that would change everything. Lisa's voice carried the steel of legal training combined with the fury of a daughter who'd nearly lost her mother to systematic medical neglect. "Mom, I've been making calls. Karen Henderson connected me with some colleagues who specialize in medical malpractice, and what they're telling me about WellPoint is criminal." Lisa's words came rapid fire, professional efficiency driven by personal rage. "We're not just fighting for your health anymore. We're fighting to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The reconciliation felt like sunrise after the longest night of Sarah's life. Years of misunderstanding and grief-driven estrangement melted away in the face of a battle that required all the strength they could muster together. Tom's photograph, now displayed on the hospital nightstand, seemed to smile with approval at his 2 strong women finally united in common cause. Outside, November snow began falling on a Vermont landscape that would soon be transformed by winter's harsh beauty. But inside the hospital room, Sarah Mitchell felt the first stirrings of hope she'd experienced since her symptoms began. December arrived like a thief in the night, stealing what remained of Sarah's strength as chemotherapy ravaged her already weakened body. The aggressive treatment protocol Dr. Harrison had prescribed was Sarah's best chance for survival, but the delayed diagnosis meant her system struggled to tolerate medications that should have been started 18 months earlier when her body possessed the resilience to fight both cancer and cure. The hospital room at Mercy General had become her world, decorated with Lisa's desperate attempts at cheer. Construction paper snowflakes that reminded Sarah of the ones they'd made together when Lisa was 7, and a small artificial Christmas tree that blinked with lights that hurt her treatment-sensitive eyes. Buddy was smuggled in each evening by sympathetic nurses who understood that some healing couldn't be found in medicine bottles. "Mom, you're going to beat this," Lisa whispered during one of the long nights when nausea made sleep impossible. And her daughter had taken leave from her Boston law firm, sleeping in the uncomfortable bedside chair and holding Sarah's hand through waves of sickness that seemed to pull her further from shore with each passing day. "We caught it in time. Dr. Harrison says the treatment is working." But Sarah could feel the truth in her bones, in the way her wedding ring now fell off without resistance, in the mirror's reflection that showed a stranger wearing her face. The cancer had been growing unopposed for too long, and 2 years of medical neglect had allowed it to establish beachheads throughout her lymphatic system that would be difficult to reclaim. Jennifer Walsh's revelations had unleashed a firestorm of legal activity that felt simultaneously vindicating and exhausting. The former WellPoint employee had provided internal documents showing that Sarah's case was part of a systematic pattern of care denial driven by profit margins rather than medical necessity. Cease and desist letters from Apex Investment Partners' legal team arrived daily, threatening consequences for what they termed defamatory accusations against respected medical professionals. The financial devastation was complete. Medical bills now exceeded $47,000, a sum that would have taken Sarah's entire Social Security income nearly 3 years to repay. The farmhouse that had sheltered her marriage and widowhood now faced foreclosure proceedings, adding the loss of home to the growing catalog of cancer's casualties. Mrs. Henderson's condition had deteriorated even faster than Sarah's. The pancreatic cancer that WellPoint had dismissed as acid reflux had claimed her the week before Thanksgiving, leaving Sarah to face her own battle without the neighbor who had become her strongest ally in the fight against medical indifference. The funeral had been small but fierce, attended by family members whose anger at preventable loss burned like December ice. She didn't have to die, Karen Henderson had told Sarah at the graveside service, her words carrying the weight of irreversible tragedy. If they'd done a simple blood test 6 months earlier, Mom would be here helping us plan Christmas dinner instead of lying in this frozen ground. Dr. Harrison's latest scan results brought news that landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of consequence that would reshape everything Sarah thought she knew about her prognosis. The lymphoma was responding to treatment, but slowly, and the delay had allowed complications that made each day a negotiation between hope and surrender. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you about what we're facing," Dr. Harrison said, her young face bearing the burden of delivering news no doctor wanted to share. "The treatment is working, but your body has been compromised by 2 years without proper care. We're fighting an uphill battle that should have been won easily if we'd started treatment when your symptoms first appeared." Christmas Eve approached like a deadline neither Sarah nor her family wanted to acknowledge. The tree in her hospital room blinked its cheerful lights while outside, Vermont winter painted the world in shades of white that reminded Sarah of the surrender flag she'd seen too many times during her nursing career. Tom's Purple Heart sat on her bedside table, catching the reflection of Christmas lights and casting tiny rainbows on the ceiling that felt like promises from a husband who was waiting for her somewhere beyond the reach of cancer and medical malpractice. Christmas Eve morning brought visitors that Sarah hadn't expected, their arrival announced by the kind of formal gravity that accompanies life-changing revelations. Dr. Harrison entered her hospital room, followed by 2 people in military dress uniforms whose bearing spoke of Pentagon authority and classified secrets that were about to see daylight. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Morrison from the Department of Veterans Affairs and Dr. James Chen from the Army Medical Research Command," Dr. Harrison said, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed inappropriate for a cancer ward, but perfectly suited for the bombshell about to detonate Sarah's understanding of her illness. Colonel Morrison's handshake was firm despite Sarah's weakened condition, her eyes carrying the weight of institutional guilt and personal responsibility. "Mrs. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is information that was classified until this morning. Your medical records, combined with similar cases Dr. Harrison has been tracking, have forced the Pentagon to declassify a program that directly relates to your condition." Sarah felt Lisa's hand tighten on hers as Dr. Chen opened a thick folder containing documents that bore the official seals of multiple government agencies. "Mrs. Mitchell, between 1978 and 1982, you were stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, working in the field hospital there. During that time, the base was conducting classified medical research involving chemical compounds that we now know were carcinogenic." The words hit Sarah like artillery fire, each revelation reshaping her understanding of the past 45 years. Fort Detrick, where she'd met Tom during a temporary nursing assignment, where they'd fallen in love walking between buildings that housed both healing and horror. You're telling me the Army poisoned me? We're telling you that experimental chemical exposure protocols contaminated the water supply and air quality at Fort Detrick for 4 years, Colonel Morrison said, her voice carrying the formal precision of someone delivering news that would trigger congressional investigations. 3,847 military personnel were exposed, including yourself and your late husband, Thomas Mitchell. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, her medical training translating the military jargon into human terms. Sarah, Tom's cancer and your lymphoma are both consistent with exposure to the specific chemical compounds used in those experiments. The Pentagon has been tracking cases for decades, but the exposure was classified until patterns became undeniable. Lisa's legal mind immediately grasped the implications. You're saying the government has known for 45 years that my parents were exposed to carcinogens and they've been covering it up while veterans died from preventable cancers? The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Chen's admission that sounded like a confession at Nuremberg. Ms. Mitchell, your mother's case became the tipping point because her symptoms were so systematically ignored by civilian doctors. When Dr. Harrison connected your mother's military service to her cancer presentation, she contacted our Veterans Health Surveillance Program. We discovered that WellPoint Medical Group has been treating dozens of Fort Detrick veterans, and in every case, obvious cancer symptoms were misdiagnosed as psychiatric illness. The second revelation struck like lightning, illuminating a landscape Sarah thought she understood. Dr. Harrison's face carried the complexity of someone harboring professional and personal secrets that were about to converge. Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else you need to know about my involvement in your case. My last name isn't just Harrison, it's Harrison Stone. Sarah's weakened heart managed to race despite the medications coursing through her system. Stone, as in Dr. Patricia Stone from WellPoint. Patricia Stone is my mother, Dr. Harrison said, her voice carrying years of family conflict and professional shame. I became an oncologist specifically to fight the kind of medicine she practices. When I saw your case, I knew I was looking at the result of everything I've been trying to prevent. The family dynamics that had driven Rebecca Harrison into medicine created a subplot of Shakespearean complexity. A daughter working to expose the medical neglect enabled by her own mother, personal relationships destroyed by professional integrity, and the generational divide between profit-driven healthcare and patient advocacy. Dr. Stone, your mother, she knew what she was doing when she dismissed my symptoms? Sarah's voice carried the hoarse whisper of someone whose vocal cords bore the physical evidence of medical neglect. Rebecca's tears fell onto official documents that would soon trigger the largest medical malpractice investigation in Vermont history. Mom forgot that medicine is about healing people, not hitting efficiency metrics. I became a doctor to remember what she chose to forget. But the revelations weren't finished. Colonel Morrison produced another folder, this one containing documents that would reshape Sarah's understanding of her own marriage and the man she'd loved for 34 years. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband Thomas filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense 6 months before his death. He documented his symptoms, his military service, and his suspicions about Fort Detrick exposure. Tom's final gift emerged from classified files like a love letter written in legal terminology and medical evidence. He'd known his cancer was connected to military service, had spent his final months building a case that would protect Sarah if she developed similar symptoms, and had died believing his research might save other veterans from the fate that was claiming his life. Tom left me a roadmap? Sarah whispered, understanding for the first time that her husband's meticulous documentation of his illness hadn't been the obsession of a dying man, but the legacy of someone who'd recognized patterns his wife might someday need to survive. The sealed envelope Tom had left with his attorney contained not just legal documents but a handwritten letter that made Sarah sob with recognition of love that transcended death. Sarah, If you're reading this, it means they tried to kill you too. Fight them. Use everything I've gathered. I'll be waiting for you, but not yet. You've got work to do first. Jennifer Walsh's true identity completed the puzzle with revelations that connected corporate malfeasance to government cover-ups in ways that would fuel investigative journalism for years. The former WellPoint employee hadn't just been a billing coordinator. She'd been an environmental engineer at the chemical company that had manufactured the compounds used in Fort Detrick experiments. "I designed some of those chemicals," Jennifer confessed during a conference call that included Lisa's legal team and military investigators. "When I saw veterans developing cancers identical to what our animal studies predicted, I tried to blow the whistle. The company destroyed my career, so I took the job at WellPoint to document how they were covering up veteran deaths." The corporate connections revealed a conspiracy that stretched from 1980s military experimentation to present-day healthcare fraud. Apex Investment Partners, the company that owned WellPoint, also held controlling interests in the chemical manufacturer that had poisoned Fort Detrick. They were literally profiting twice. First from creating the carcinogens, then from providing inadequate treatment for the cancers those chemicals caused. Mrs. Henderson's role in Sarah's story took on darker dimensions with the revelation that her friendship had been partially manufactured. WellPoint had identified Sarah as a potential whistleblower early in her treatment and had arranged for Mrs. Henderson to befriend her, normalizing symptoms and discouraging second opinions through carefully orchestrated social pressure. "But Sarah, honey, about 6 months ago I couldn't keep lying to you," Mrs. Henderson had confessed during her final hospital stay. "You reminded me of my own daughter, and I knew you were dying just like I was. That's when I told you to get a second opinion, even though they were paying me to keep you calm and compliant." Buddy's behavior throughout Sarah's illness gained new significance with the revelation that Tom had specifically chosen a medical detection dog trained to identify chemical exposure symptoms. The golden retriever hadn't just been detecting cancer. He'd been alerting Sarah to the specific biomarkers associated with Fort Detrick contamination, faithfully performing the job Tom had trained him for. The Pentagon's response arrived with the full weight of institutional damage control and genuine remorse. Military officials who had spent decades managing classified information suddenly found themselves explaining 45 years of cover-ups to families whose loved ones had died from preventable diseases. "Mrs. Mitchell, your country owes you more than we can ever repay," General Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone authorized to make promises that would cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. "We failed you twice. Once when we exposed you to carcinogens without informed consent, and again when we allowed civilian doctors to ignore symptoms we should have been monitoring." The Christmas Eve revelations transformed Sarah's hospital room into the center of a storm that would reshape military healthcare, corporate accountability, and medical education. Phone calls from congressional offices, major news networks, and international human rights organizations turned her bedside into an unlikely command center for justice that was 45 years overdue. As midnight approached on Christmas Eve, Sarah found herself surrounded by family, military officials, and the evidence that her fight for proper medical care had uncovered one of the largest government cover-ups in American history. Tom's Purple Heart caught the reflection of Christmas lights, and Sarah finally understood that her husband's final mission had been ensuring she would have the ammunition needed to win a war he couldn't fight himself. 6 months after the Christmas Eve revelations that shook the Pentagon, Sarah Mitchell stood in her renovated farmhouse kitchen, morning sunlight streaming through windows that Lisa had replaced during the spring restoration. The woman who had nearly died from medical neglect now moved with the careful energy of someone who understood the precious nature of each breath, each day, each moment of unexpected survival. The specialized treatment protocol developed specifically for Fort Detrick exposure victims had succeeded beyond Dr. Harrison's most optimistic projections. Sarah's lymphoma had entered complete remission, the aggressive cancer retreating before military medical resources that spared no expense in treating veterans the government had inadvertently poisoned. The nodules that had once dominated her neck were now invisible, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of battles fought and won. "Mom, the reporter from 60 Minutes is here," Lisa called from the front porch, her voice carrying the warmth that had returned to their relationship along with Sarah's health. The estrangement that had defined their recent years had dissolved in hospital waiting rooms and legal conferences, replaced by the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter who had faced death together and emerged victorious. The class action lawsuit that began with Sarah's case had grown into the largest military medical malpractice settlement in American history. $847 million distributed among 3,847 veterans and their families, with Sarah receiving compensation that ensured she would never again face financial ruin due to medical bills. The farmhouse that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now debt-free and updated with accessibility features that honored both her recovery and her age. WellPoint Medical Group had closed permanently, its medical licenses revoked and its corporate charter dissolved. Dr. Webb and Dr. Stone faced criminal charges for medical fraud, their careers destroyed by evidence of systematic patient neglect driven by profit incentives. Apex Investment Partners had declared bankruptcy, its executives facing congressional investigations that would likely result in federal prison sentences. Jennifer Walsh sat at Sarah's kitchen table, her own transformation as dramatic as Sarah's medical recovery. The former engineer-turned-whistleblower had been hired as patient advocate coordinator at Mercy General, her insider knowledge of corporate medical fraud making her invaluable in protecting other patients from similar abuse. Her children, once threatened by poverty when she lost her WellPoint job, now attended private schools funded by the substantial reward she'd received for exposing the conspiracy. "Sarah, when I think about how close we came to losing you," Jennifer said, accepting a cup of coffee from hands that no longer trembled with illness or medication side effects. "If Mrs. Henderson hadn't found you that Thanksgiving morning, if you hadn't had the strength to keep fighting when everyone told you to give up." The memory of collapse and near death had been transformed into gratitude for second chances and vindication delayed but not denied. Sarah's daily routine now included morning walks with Buddy through apple orchards that had been replanted with varieties Tom would have loved, afternoon sessions answering calls from veterans who needed guidance navigating military healthcare systems, and evening phone conversations with grandchildren she was finally healthy enough to enjoy. Rebecca Harrison had become more than Sarah's oncologist. She had evolved into the daughter Sarah wished she could have given Lisa, a young woman whose dedication to ethical medicine represented hope for healthcare's future. The family dynamics that had initially complicated their relationship, Rebecca's mother being one of the doctors who had nearly killed Sarah through neglect, had resolved through forgiveness that benefited everyone involved. "Mrs. Mitchell, your case is being taught in medical schools across the country," Rebecca said during one of Sarah's monthly follow-up appointments. "First-year students study your symptoms and treatment timeline as an example of what happens when profit motives override patient care. You're literally saving lives by helping train doctors who will never make the mistakes that almost killed you." The Pentagon had established the Thomas and Sarah Mitchell Center for Military Environmental Health at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, a facility dedicated to researching and treating illnesses caused by classified chemical exposures. The irony of having a medical center named after victims of government negligence wasn't lost on Sarah, but the facility's mission to prevent future Fort Detrick situations provided meaning that transformed personal tragedy into institutional change. Lisa's law practice had evolved to specialize in medical malpractice cases involving veteran care, her expertise gained through her mother's ordeal, now protecting other families from similar ordeals. The legal precedents established by Sarah's case had strengthened patient rights and corporate accountability in ways that would influence healthcare law for generations. "Mom, I keep thinking about what Dad would say if he could see you now," Lisa said as they prepared Thanksgiving dinner in a kitchen filled with family for the first time in years. Fighting the government, defeating cancer, becoming a national advocate for veteran health care rights, he'd be so proud. Tom's legacy lived on through changes that extended far beyond their Vermont farmhouse. The Purple Heart that had once symbolized his sacrifice now represented a broader commitment to protecting veterans from institutional betrayal. Congressional legislation nicknamed Tom's Law required automatic medical screening for all personnel exposed to classified chemical programs, ensuring future military families wouldn't suffer the decades-long delays that had characterized Fort Detrick victims. Buddy, now showing his age but still devoted to his protective duties, had become something of a celebrity in the medical detection dog community. His ability to identify chemical exposure symptoms had led to a breeding program that would produce future generations of dogs capable of alerting veterans to health problems their doctors might miss or dismiss. The Christmas Eve that had brought revelations capable of toppling governments was now celebrated annually as Truth Day in the Mitchell household, a family tradition that honored the moment when decades of lies finally yielded to documented facts and institutional accountability. Sarah's hospital room, where Pentagon officials had first admitted their cover-up, was now a patient education center where other families learned about their rights to question medical authority and demand proper care. As Sarah looked around her restored farmhouse, filled with family and friends whose presence testified to survival against overwhelming odds, she reflected on the journey from dismissed symptoms to national vindication. The fight that had begun with a simple request for medical tests had evolved into a crusade that changed laws, closed corrupt medical practices, and saved countless lives. "Every morning is still a blessing," she told the 60 Minutes interviewer, echoing words she'd spoken during her darkest days. "But now I know that fighting for those blessings, fighting for truth, for proper medical care, for accountability, that fight is a blessing too." Sarah Mitchell's story isn't just about one veteran's fight against medical neglect. It's about the quiet courage that lives in every American who's ever been dismissed, ignored, or told their concerns don't matter. At 67, Sarah faced the terrifying reality that millions of us confront. Doctors who see profit margins instead of patients, insurance companies that value efficiency over empathy, and a healthcare system that treats aging as a character flaw rather than a natural part of life's journey. But Sarah's triumph reminds us that our voices still matter. Our instincts about our own bodies are valid, and fighting for proper care isn't selfishness, it's survival. Her transformation from dismissed patient to national advocate proves that it's never too late to stand up for ourselves and protect others from the same injustices. The farmhouse where she once faced foreclosure over medical bills is now filled with grandchildren's laughter and the satisfaction that comes from making a difference. Sarah discovered that sometimes our greatest battles come not in our youth, but in our golden years, when wisdom meets determination and creates change that echoes through generations. Her story whispers the truth many of us need to hear. You're not too old to fight for your life, and you're definitely not too old to win. Have you or a loved one ever felt dismissed by healthcare providers, and what steps did you take to advocate for proper care? What signs do you think we should watch for to ensure we're receiving quality medical attention rather than cost-cutting shortcuts? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might help another person find the courage to speak up for their health.